Okay, Dad, today is Monday, June 3rd, and I think we have to talk about China and Taiwan. Every day, there's always developments
Uh-huh.
in the Middle East and Ukraine. But I feel like we should try to cover something over China and Taiwan. I saw your eyebrows go up a bit. So, just anybody watching, we never prep. I don't prepare my dad at all on the topics. I just hit him with whatever's on my mind. Um,
Yeah, sometimes
but
it shows.
No, but I think you're actually the perfect person to talk about China Taiwan because you are married to a Taiwanese woman. You're a Chinese English translator. You speak Chinese fluently. You read Chinese fluently. You've lived in Taiwan. You have a master's in Oriental Studies from UC Berkeley. I think you're more than qualified to talk on the subject. I know a lot of your time has been absorbed with the conflicts in Ukraine, in the Middle East. But I heard a podcast recently on the Duran. I'm sure you heard it as well. And I started just looking up some news. It looks like the US is really trying to gear up for war against China. We have just moved troops in the Philippines, boosting our presence there. We are doing war games. We have pushing a pro independence movement in Taiwan. China said this is a red line, reddest of lines for them.
Right.
So yeah, maybe you can just take it from there. What is your analysis of the situation?
Well, yeah, certainly I would say it's the tensest that it's been since I've been, associated with Taiwan. And that goes back like 35 years or so. Yeah, first time I went to Taiwan was 1986. And that's the year I married your mother and when I began learning Chinese. And it was something that, even way back then, of course, people talked about is are the Chinese, the mainland Chinese, are they going to invade someday? I guess I would just first like to just talk about the contrast between the Taiwan that I knew then and the geopolitical situation then, which would be roughly 1986 or 1988, and now. Yeah, then uh, mainland China was a dirt poor country, and it was the ideological division was really stark. One was uh, mainland China was clearly communist in its orientation. The reforms had begun, and so there were the stirrings of the initial stirrings of capitalism, but they were limited to just certain special economic zones, like in Shenzhen, for example. And Taiwan was a very prosperous, a very successful um, island. And a lot of people said that it's really probably that the example of Taiwan is what convinced the leadership, Deng Xiaoping and others, more than anything else, to go down the reform route. Because you can look at different countries around the world and say, okay, well, capitalism does seem to work here pretty well. They're prosperous, but they're not Chinese. We Chinese, we're just different. But they were Chinese, of course, on the island of Taiwan, and they were doing they were very, very successful capitalists, and the contrast was huge. I mean, to give you an idea of what like the contrast was like back then, um, my father-in-law, he was with Chiang Kai-shek's army, and he came down with Chiang Kai-shek across the Taiwan Strait in 1949, and was told, he left a family, a wife, back in mainland China. He was told by his commanding officer, well, we'll be here for a couple of weeks and then we're going to go back. And then, several weeks passed and it became, well, a couple of months and then a couple of years. And then my father-in-law's elder brother said, I think we're not going back. I think you better look for another wife here. And that's what happened. Um, but in the 1980s, after the reforms began and these more ties were established between, there was something of a thaw between Taiwan, the Republic of China on Taiwan, and the People's Republic of China on the mainland. It was possible for him to go back. But when he did, apparently it was not a very pleasant experience because it was just like the whole village was just kind of uh, just saw him as as the rich guy from Taiwan, and everybody came to his like, hey. second cousin or third cousin, um, you sheeping, what, don't you remember? Or my dad was so close to your dad, and yeah, they were doing whatever they could to try to get something, some of his money, really, and and he came there, I guess, just with like a truckload of TVs and refrigerators and dispensed them, but it was never enough. And I just sort of, I mean, I think he felt like he was just sort of like batting mosquitoes. I mean, people were just constantly trying to get a little bit of his wealth while he was there because there was such a stark difference. I mean, the um, Taiwan was a very developed country, that had all the material goods, all the, the advanced consumer items, and China didn't. It was still, it had, with the, exceptions of just these few special economic zones, it was still mired in poverty, and conditions were very, very primitive. So, there was, back then, there really wasn't much worry about, I, clearly there was this effort to improve relations on both sides, and economic ties were being established, and mainland China was heading towards, um, you know, uh, people were thinking, well, they'll just become normal. They'll become like us. They'll become another Western country. And I think the Taiwanese kind of had a lot of the same idea. And then it also, back then, it was clear too that China did not have the military means to take Taiwan. The U.S. was far more powerful than mainland China was, and could very easily protect Taiwan at that time. And Taiwan had it was well supplied by the U.S. I don't think there was any question. But now you just move forward, 25, 30 years to the present time, and things have changed entirely. I mean, it's just now, I think you had this experience too. It's just like when you go from mainland China, from a place like Shanghai to Taiwan, Taiwan actually seems a little bit backwards. You know,
Mhm.
um, it's not that it's poor, but it actually just seems a little dirtier and kind of run down, and they don't have all the advanced technologies, not to the extent that they're available in mainland China. The progress on mainland China has been stunning. They've caught up with Taiwan, and then they've surpassed it really in a lot of ways. And then ideologically, things have changed very much too. I mean, it's just that before we had this, this was the free capitalist world, and this was the communist world on the other side. Now, um, it's, though the Communist Party of China is still in charge in Taiwan, they're obviously a very different party with, with very different policies. The country is, is to all intents and purposes, yeah, capitalism has taken root there and has thrived and succeeded. And then the old communist ideology of class conflict and the workers' proletariat and all, rather the dictatorship of the proletariat and all of that. That's really gone. I mean, I guess it technically exists, but nobody believes in it. And I can see, I watch a lot of Chinese dramas. A lot of them are set, or are historical, like set in the times, like in the 40s or in the or the early part of the 20th century. And the communists appear in there, and the nationalists, but it's the communists are always portrayed, their ideological, their emphasis on class conflict, and and taking down the bourgeoisie and the landlords. That's pretty much, it's either just not mentioned, or it's softened to a great degree. It's really played down, and what they play up is nationalism. But the communists, that's what they stand on. I mean, when they portray themselves to their people, and they relate their history, in China. What they talk about a nationalist struggle. That's what we did. We led this nationalist struggle, and we drove out the imperialists, in particular the Japanese, and that's the source of their legitimacy now. I mean, that's what. So we have something very different, and then in Taiwan, well, you used to have the Kuomintang, that's the nationalist party in charge. And though, they were ideologically opposed to the communists, they both agreed on the one China principle. That's not true anymore. I mean, because, well, no, it's true. The Kuomintang still favors the one China principle. You have leaders like Ma Ying-jeou, actually, who was recently in China, I think met with Xi Jinping and is trying to encourage dialogue and peaceful reunion. But they're not the people in charge in Taiwan. It's the Minjindang, the the DPP, which is a leftist party, but it's also a nationalist party in the sense not of Chinese nationalism, but Taiwanese nationalism. And that's actually, yeah, made things much more tense. That's a big part of what's going on now. So a lot of things have changed. Before the mainland Chinese, they were poor, they were militarily weak in spite of being very big, but now they're very technologically very advanced. They've been building up their military. They've been thinking about, what it's going to take to what they're going to need to do to take Taiwan if the need arises. They've been preparing for it, and and um, and for them, it is a question of legitimacy. It's an existential question. I should say that this is our territory. These people are with the help of one of the old imperialists, the Americans. If you look at these, like at these period dramas, like set in the 30s or 40s or whatever, it's like the bad guys are the ones that collaborate with the imperialists, right? And the good guys are the nationalists. They're the China, they're Chinese for the Chinese. And I don't think people understand, how bad it looks, when the U.S. intervenes directly in Taiwan. It's just that looks like a replay to them of the imperialist intervention, back in um, the earlier part of the 20th century. We don't think of that. We don't, because we just don't know their history. We never know the histories of these places where we get involved, right? We're just standing up for freedom, and we're just for the Taiwanese against the Chinese bullies. Um, but they look at it and they see, the intervening in their internal affairs. This was something. This was a part of a civil war that never really ended, and they were hoping for a peaceful resolution. But they've always said that if Taiwan declares independence, they will use military force to unite Taiwan to mainland China. And what we're getting now is just that the Taiwanese government is just edging ever closer to an outright declaration of independence. Starting, like when the DPP, this Taiwanese Nationalist Party, took over or first took power, a couple decades ago. They began to do things, kind of on the edges, like they changed the name of an agency from, it used to be the China Department of something and something, and they would change it to the Taiwanese Department of something and something. Um, and now, like, but still, um, they still calls, they still do call themselves the Chinese, the Republic of China on Taiwan. Though you'll find, like in these DPP rallies, they're often not waving. They're not waving the ROC flag, the Republic of China. They're waving a Taiwanese flag that has, a picture of their island in green on it, and increasingly they're not even referring to themselves as China. And the speech that the new president of Taiwan, who was a DPP candidate, he really went farther than anybody did in describing China as being something separate from China. He, it's clear that he's abandoning the one China principle. That was the agreement, that allowed the thaw in relations that I saw back in the 1980s. Um, but they are clearly retreating from that, and they are edging closer and closer to an outright declaration of independence. And again, it's just like China has been saying for a long time, if you do that, we will use military force. And the U.S., the U.S. like technically, if you go to like the State Department website or whatever, say, oh yeah, we support the one China policy. We're in favor of a unified China. We don't regard Taiwan as a separate nation. But it's clear that substantively we are supporting this trend towards Taiwanese independence, and we are approaching this red line. And we're not telling that, maybe we tell them, hey, slow down or whatever. But when, for example, the new president of Taiwan gave the speech, there were no clear no reprimands from the U.S. government, and the Chinese noticed that. So
Mm.
we are in a very different situation. Now China does have the means to retake Taiwan. I think it would be a difficult fight because it's an island. It would have to be a marine operation. But the one thing is, don't forget, Taiwan is only has a population that's like less than 1/30th of that of mainland China. When we're
Less than
talking about,
that, right?
yeah,
30
well, probably
million?
less than that. I think it's 30 million. Um,
It's the population of
30,
Shanghai, just so people know, where I
yeah,
lived for
okay, yeah,
10 years.
one city, and you're right,
Right.
right. And then China's over a billion, right?
1.4 billion, right?
1.4 billion. I
Yeah.
even lost track. I can't keep up with these things. Okay, yeah, it's a lot more than that. Um, and like when the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Ukraine's actually a very big country. I think sometimes people forget that. Russia's an enormous country. But Ukraine's a very large country, both in land area, and it has um, a substantial population. It's larger than Taiwan's. Taiwan's a pretty dense population. Um, and and Russia doesn't have nearly the population of that mainland China does. So the ratio is actually much more skewed in the case of China, mainland China, and Taiwan. And there used to be this technological advantage, of course, that Taiwan and the U.S. had. They have it no longer. And what I've heard is that whenever, like, the U.S. war games, a battle over Taiwan, like with the U.S. intervening to protect Taiwan against mainland Chinese, the the U.S. always loses. And then, as I mentioned, it's probably even worse than that because we've talked about this earlier that the U.S. really hasn't taken into account like the possibility of a war of attrition. They figure that everything would be decided like within a month, and that's their whole. The U.S. military, as we've discussed earlier, is kind of completely set up for these quick conflicts. The kinds of weapons they use, the kind of training, and so on and so forth, are for are um, are geared towards a conflict that is rather quickly resolved in a matter of a few weeks. And they're not prepared, as we're seeing in Ukraine, for a war of attrition that could go on for months and months and months. And if there's any country in the world that's prepared for that, it's China. I mean, they can.
Mm.
But I heard this. I don't even know if it's true. I heard this on Taiwanese news saying that China can outproduce the U.S. in when it comes to ships. They can produce 230 times the ships at 230 times the rate that the U.S. can. Now, maybe
I
that's an
don't
exaggeration, but if
I
it's
don't
even
doubt
like
it.
a,
I don't
yeah,
doubt it for a second.
right. And then I
I've
think it's just
seen.
like, right. Well, you can say Russia's outproducing the U.S. and all of NATO and things like shells and tanks and whatever. And there's no sign that even the U.S. is going to catch up. Imagine China. So, I mean, I maybe China fails to take Taiwan right away, but it turns into some sort of, war of attrition. Again, I think we're just destined to lose it.
Mm.
But even the war games that they do for the shorter term conflict shows China winning. I mean, it's their backyard. They've got the all the advantages in terms of logistics, um, and it's way on the other side of a 5,000-mile wide ocean for us. But like you said at the beginning of this, for some reason, we seem to be dead set on having, a conflict with them. I've been hearing this over the last year, just sort of talking about the coming war with China, like it's an inevitability. It's just why, why does it have to be an inevitability? Again, it's not on our borders. It's
Yeah,
it's
it's
way on the other
complete
side of the world.
insanity. One of the reasons I didn't even kind of want to bring it up because I already thought that the idea of this conflict was just too insane. I was like, there's no way that we would try to get embroiled into a conflict in the Far East when we have an absolute mess in Europe, an absolute mess in the Middle East. Like, there's no way, maybe people don't like China and they or whatever, but surely we're not going to be devoting, any real, military power over there for a conflict. But it seems like we are. Um, but one thing I want to ask you is, the DPP you said is in power, and they are this Taiwanese nationalist party. Does that mean that the majority of Taiwanese support independence for Taiwan? What is it
No, I
on the
don't think
ground for the
so.
Taiwanese?
Right. They actually won not with a majority, but with a plurality. What happened in the recent election is that um, the opposition to the DPP was split. There was going to be one candidate, and but another one, insisted on running with had his own independent, his separate party, a third party, and that split the vote. The anti-DPP vote and the anti-Taiwanese independence vote. Um, so I would say no, there's not a majority for independence for an independent Taiwan. Yeah, there is. There people have different views. As your mother and your aunts actually they're very sympathetic. This is another thing that's changed over the years because I remember back in the 1980s. Certainly if you were the only people who wanted reunification with China on the PRC's terms were leftists, like outright communists. I remember one of my teachers at the Chinese school was, uh, you know, uh, fit that description. Um, but conservatives, would had 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 no interest in reunification back then because you know China was uh, China was communist, and at that time, Taiwan had a conservative capitalist government. Um, but times have really changed. Now it's a bunch of leftists that are running Taiwan. And which are very similar to very Western leftists like the Democratic Party in the U.S. They're nationalist leftists. And then China, like I was saying, has really changed. They're not about class conflict anymore, and they're about nationalism and building up the strength of the Chinese nation. So there are a lot of people, like your mother and your aunt and others who are actually very sympathetic and want to reunify with China. Say we're Chinese, and they can say we're proud of what mainland China is doing. We want to be together. We're one people, and I think that's essentially true. I mean, it's a fiction that the Taiwanese are some sort of separate group. I mean, I guess if you want to declare you have your own identity, maybe I don't really understand this, but I just remember like all the temples there. You go in there and the Chinese sages and what there were Chinese sages in the temple. There's not a
Hmm.
special Taiwanese. The holidays that they celebrate. They're all Chinese holidays,
Hmm.
and the
Well,
language
they're
they speak
Chinese.
is also
They're
yeah,
Han
it's also
Chinese. They
spoken.
speak Chinese. Yeah, right, right.
Yeah. Now they speak
Yeah.
something, well, they call it Taiwanese, or it's also known as Southern Fukienese, which is also spoken on the
In
other side of the
Fujian,
Taiwan
right.
Strait in Fujian.
Fujianhua, right.
Right. It's a dialect that's part of China, and it's very
Hmm.
similar to other Chinese dialects, you could say. Yeah, essentially they're Chinese, but I think it's very similar in a lot of ways to like what happened in Ukraine. I mean, there are a lot of Ukrainians that are just out and out Russians, and then others are they've had somewhat of a separate experience and whatever, but the language they speak is actually very similar. It's basically a dialect of Russian, and Russians can understand what they're saying, but they're they're uh, but they've tried to create this fiction that like all of us I suppose you could make the argument like the people out in Western Ukraine have a separate identity and but it really doesn't work for not at all for Eastern and Southern Ukraine and really not very well for Central Ukraine either. That there's just the links to Russia are just too obvious. But there was this pretense that no, we are the separate nation, Ukraine, that has nothing to do with Russia. But we're just a separate people entirely. And you see the same thing happening in Taiwan. And
Hmm.
of course, it's something that it's just like leaves the Russians, first perplexed and then angered. And I think you see the same thing happening in China. It's like, hey, come on, you're Chinese. What's this pretense? That we have nothing to do with you. We were always, we were one people. So this is,
Hmm.
and you do have people in Taiwan that recognize that, again, and actually do want to peacefully reunify. And most of them are in the old Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party. But you do have these Taiwanese nationalists in the DPP that insist that they're separate people and have nothing to do with it, nothing to do with the Chinese or, you know, uh, maybe I'm exaggerating a little their position a little, but not much. I've
Right.
met those people and they're very extreme. Yeah.
Right. I feel like within the United States, the majority of Taiwanese Americans have a Taiwanese nationalist identity. I think that is more here. But for me, I had a very different experience because I lived in Shanghai for 10 years and I knew many Taiwanese people in China. I employed several Chinese people at my company in Shanghai. Um, and it just, they obviously, I don't think people realize that China is right next to Taiwan, and Taiwan's right next to China. There are a lot of opportunities for Taiwanese in China, and like
Right.
you're saying before, Taiwan is it's past its heyday. It's dilapidated. Like you said, that I mentioned when I went back to Taiwan. So when I was in Shanghai, I've flown to would fly to Hong Kong or fly to Taipei on multiple occasions. And I always have the impression that I'm like going almost to a third world country when I go to Hong Kong or Taipei. The third world's too harsh. But the fact is that
Uh-huh.
the infrastructure is outdated. It's old. It doesn't seem modern. And when I go back to Shanghai, I feel like I'm going back to the first world. And I think a lot of people have the perception of Taiwan and China reversed. They feel like, oh, Hong Kong and
Uh-huh.
Taipei, that's where the progress and the success is. Like, okay, maybe in the 80s and the 90s for sure. But you go to China now, how modern it is. Cities like
Hmm.
Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Beijing, Shanghai, they're incredible. And the Taiwanese know that too. And so when they're looking for economic opportunities, they know that there's not as many for them in Taiwan. A lot of them go to China. There's a lot of benefits going to China. Like you said, they speak the language, so it's no problem. In terms of getting visas, if you're Taiwanese, you get
Right.
the Taibao. It's no problem to
Right.
work there. You actually get a benefit. It's great for us when we hire Taiwanese because when you hire mainland Chinese people, you have to as an employer you have to pay a lot of money for their pension, their housing. About a third, you pay of their salary. I have to pay extra for all these other things, but not for Taiwanese because they're technically they don't have to pay for the pension, so they have a lower tax bracket for themselves and for the company. So it's very lucrative
Yeah.
for Taiwanese people to work in China. Very easy for them to, and they kind of are able to often sort of be that bridge between the West and China as well.
Right.
I've met a lot of Taiwanese just in Shanghai. If you go down to Fujian, you go to Xiamen, it's full of Taiwanese. And like you said, they speak
Yeah.
the same language, Taiwanese, Fujianhua. It's the same
Yeah.
language. So one
Right.
of my former employees ended up moving from Shanghai down to Fujian because he wanted to hang out with more Taiwanese people, in
Right.
China, and so there's
Yeah.
just a massive Taiwanese community. So my impression always was like, yeah, China and Taiwan are very close, and it's getting closer. So I was kind of surprised to hear that. Where's this nationalist movement coming from? Because what I saw when I was living in China was, you could take a flight to Taiwan. It takes you 2 hours, and you can speak the language, come back. You can work in either place. I didn't see any tension. I felt like, yeah, there was a good bond between China and Taiwan. And now it seems like all of a sudden there's this independence and war. Is it happening because the United States is doing something similar like what they
Yeah.
did in Ukraine with the
Yeah. Well,
National Endowment for Democracy, start pumping money to prop up certain independent nationalist movements to break away? Is that because for me
yeah.
it doesn't make sense if I as a Taiwanese person what are you going to do? Do you speak English fluently? No. Do you have the money to try to go through the whole visa process to work in America or whatever? No, most of them go to China. It's easier. It makes sense.
Hmm.
There's more opportunities for them there. Anyways, that's my
Right.
my rant. So what do you
Yeah.
think? Is the U.S. manipulating this?
Well, I mean, there's just, yeah, I think it's played a very similar role in Taiwan very similar to the role that it's played in Ukraine. And that's by simply propping up the nationalists, like the extremist wing, the ones that's no compromise. If the U.S. was not there and said, "Okay, you guys are on your own," just like this, whether it's Ukraine or Taiwan, you're on your own. Okay, well, you just got to deal with your bigger neighbor. I think that we would have had a completely different outcome because people would just be very realistic and say, "Well, um, these guys like we need to compromise with our bigger neighbor, and it's not just like okay, they're a military threat, but we have a lot of it's really to our advantage. Again, this is a um, this will be to our benefit all around, to to increase trade and contacts and so on and so forth. Again, I think it applies equally to both places, Taiwan and Ukraine. But you have the U.S. in the background lending its support to these extreme nationalists and these people who probably would have been sidelined otherwise because they say, hey, you guys are just not being realistic, or this is stupid, or what, are you going to get into a war and then we'll get clobbered and it's going to be terrible all around. Well, they can keep on saying, well, we've got the U.S. at our backs. The U.S. has promised us that we're going to, they'll come to our aid. The U.S. has promised us, like, if we pursue these policies, they'll support us economically and other, militarily. And so they, the nationalist uh, um, element, the one is that avoids or is opposed to any kind of negotiations or compromise. That's the one that grows in power and ends up taking over the government. And that's what you've seen in both places. Yeah, just without a doubt, the U.S. has supported that tendency in Taiwan.
Something.
Especially recently, there was a time. There was a time when I think, the U.S. policy was more balanced and they were sticking to the one China principle, but they have been slowly retreating from that, steadily retreating from that over the last couple of decades.
Yeah, something I noticed on Twitter, on X, just over the past week was all of a sudden I started getting Taiwanese independence posts in my feed, like these clearly just sort of propagandist posts saying, just F China, Taiwan stands with Ukraine. Together, we will, we'll beat China, and all these memes, just these images of evil Xi Jinping in China and Taiwan stomping on them with the US's help. I don't know where they came from. It just popped up over a week
Hmm.
ago, and all of a sudden I started seeing them. I don't know if you noticed any of these yourselves.
I haven't
Um,
seen them. Yeah.
yeah, so I was kind of surprised because I'm not even really, I don't know why I would have been even recommended this, but it almost seems like these are almost like paid propagandists almost. Like I don't know where
Yeah.
these accounts came from. And I see the similar thing with Ukraine as
Yeah.
well.
Right.
Um,
Well, I know actually Taiwan, I mean, like the number one, the most powerful, foreign lobby, of course, is the Israel lobby in our country. But Taiwan spends a lot of money trying to affect our policy and our view of the situation. Um, and they've certainly seem to have been very successful. Now we have like the entire Republican Party. One thing is I always kind of think it's sort of funny because the TPP is just like, again, it's just like that's the woke party
mm,
in Taiwan. And the Republicans cozy up to them and, think that, yeah, we're standing with the Taiwanese people. Again, they don't know anything. They don't
well,
understand. It's just the same thing with
I
Ukraine.
know,
We stand with the
I
Ukrainians.
I know
Well, there
that.
are a heck of a lot of Ukrainians that actually stand with Russia. If you're really going to look at it, like
Well, I
your
mean,
sister knows these people,
right. Or I
and
just
the
want to
same thing in
say,
Taiwan.
yeah, I just want to say, I mean, like, Biden is just, they're always talking about the far right and how this country's infested with Nazis and white
Right.
supremacists. And Biden's supporting actual real neo-Nazis, the Azov Battalion, the far right group
Yeah.
in Ukraine. So it's funny that the left here in the United States supports the far right in Ukraine, this
Yeah.
extremist nationalist party. And then
Right.
the right in America supports the far left in Taiwan. There's
Yeah.
no
Right.
there's
Yeah.
no
They have. Yeah.
continuity with
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's just say they don't know these countries, and they're just kind of tools for their own. Well, among the elites for their own geopolitical purposes. One's a battering ram against Russia, the other's a battering ram against the PRC, and then um, yeah, they just kind of get they're just convenient props for for domestic U.S. politicians that want to sound on certain themes, but they don't. They're talking. They kind of imagine the Taiwan of Chiang Kai-shek and of many decades ago. That's just long gone. Like I told you, it's just a completely different reality now. But they don't know it. They don't care really. They just want to associate themselves with certain themes of standing tall and standing strong and um, opposing autocrats or whatever. But
well, I'm wondering if there's maybe just a fatal miscalculation for the Americans, and they did the same thing in Ukraine. Is that did they actually ask whether the Taiwanese people really want independence? You said yourself that the majority of Taiwanese don't support it, and that's my kind of consensus from my dealings with Taiwan, as well. I mean, it just reminds me of, with Ukraine in 2008. There was the announcement from the U.S. I forget where exactly, but that Ukraine will join NATO,
Yeah,
and everybody
back
was
then,
kind of
right?
shocked. But you know who they
Yeah,
didn't ask? They didn't ask the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians
yeah,
voted in a neutral government, a government that did
right,
not want to join
right,
NATO. And the
right.
US, their response was, "Oh, that's not how it's supposed to go. So we're going to have to orchestrate a coup in your country
Yeah,
for
or we're
your
gonna,
independence to
right,
save
right,
you from because we know best what you want. Then you don't you
right,
want to be with us." And I feel
right,
like the
right,
same thing
right.
is happening in Taiwan. Nobody sits around
Yeah,
and actually asks, "What do the Taiwanese want?" The majority
yeah,
of Taiwanese, they don't their situation being neutral is great. They get the
yeah,
benefits of both worlds. Like I said, opportunities in China, they can sell to the West. It's fantastic. They're not oppressed by China. Nobody, when you go to
right.
Taiwan, people aren't afraid that the Chinese are coming over. No, they're taking trips to Shanghai and Beijing and Chongqing, wherever, all the time. So it just, I don't know, it's madness. I don't understand. Like, there should be some analysis in the State Department. We're just
Oh,
two
they don't care
bums.
about that. Yeah, I mean, they
But
actually don't really care what people
well,
think on the ground. I mean, just like they
oh,
don't even care what Americans think about these things.
sure,
You know,
sure.
it's
But
just,
look, if you want to fight China and you want to use
yeah,
Taiwan, then you got to make sure Taiwan has to. They got to know that they're on the side. What's going to happen? What I think will happen is if we really push for some type of independence movement, you're going to end up starting a civil war in Taiwan because I
yeah.
probably have the most of the Chinese. Maybe some of them, maybe want the independence, but they don't want. They know war with
Some
China.
definitely do.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right. But I think some do, but I bet a lot of them also think like, well, war with China will just be the end of our
yeah.
country.
I think
So
that
they
probably
don't want that.
yeah, the great majority just wants to kind of keep things as they are. Let's kind of just keep on muddling through and talk about
Right.
reunifying someday, but and just make it clear that no, we're not going to declare independence. Um,
Yeah, respecting the one China policy is not bad. It's great for Taiwan. Taiwan
right,
gets retained. It's a lot of its autonomy. But it's autonomy in general. You go to Taiwan, they have their own government, they have their own currency, they have their own rules and laws. Speak Chinese. They have great dialogue and relationships with China. It's good for everybody. I just don't get it. It was the
uh-huh.
same thing with the Hong Kong protest. It was weird because I was there and one of my best buddies, TJ, was in Hong Kong when that was going on. And it was kind of crazy that everybody in the West was just, yeah, we got to support the Hong Kong independence, like that they were ruled by the British for 100 years. That
Right,
this is as imperialist as you can get, and now it's
right,
being just sort of rejoined peacefully with the same amount of autonomy back to China. I can tell
right,
you that the vast majority of Hong Kongese were happy with that. They were
yeah,
not, they did not support the protest. You had a bunch of college kids that probably had money pumped in from the National Endowment of Democracy, probably,
right.
funding these protests and these things. The Hong Kongese were pissed. They were like, I want to go to work. We do work with China all the time. You can walk across the bridge into the mainland. What are we doing here?
Hmm.
It's
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
it's
But it's
insanity.
something, it's kind of like it's something you see again and again. It's just that it's always, again, these places we don't know. Places are complicated. There are different factions and different, just like we should be aware within our country. We're not united about everything. Of course we're not. And sometimes these societies can be can be split, can be polarized, but we want to simplify things, and it's just always we stand with the people of Hong Kong, we stand with whatever, and it just seems like inevitably what we're standing with is always the faction that's well, pro-American and anti-Chinese or anti-Russian or whatever. That's really who you're standing with.
Mm.
That's what it's all about, and you're not really thinking about the good of that country and the views of the spectrum of views that you find in those countries or places, regions. Talking about Hong Kong, and then also you're just not talking about reality. Like in the case of Hong Kong, look, Taiwan is tiny compared to mainland China, right? but Hong Kong was just it's just like just a speck. It's just a it's a infinitesimal fraction
Mm.
of uh, the mainland Chinese population. And so what are you saying? What are they going to do? Are you going to what? It just obviously was not there. There wasn't any reality to it. And then
Yeah,
sure
right.
enough, after these protests, which actually got quite violent and included the waving of the American flag and so on, which is again provokes a very strong reaction among Chinese nationalists. Well, the Chinese kind of moved in and they just cleared away, all those dissident elements and just clamped down. And now it's all over. I mean, it was just
Mm.
stupid. Um, I would say it's the same thing in Taiwan. Again, you just have to deal with reality. This your neighbor is much bigger, and it's not just a matter of might makes right, but also you did agree to a one China principle. Everybody got together and agreed that you are in fact one country, and
But
you hope to work it out peacefully. But by one
there's
means
just
or another, you will become one country. The U.S. agreed to that. Taiwan, we so we just don't. We have neither, reality or even really justice on our side, on
mm.
this.
Right. I don't know what the impression is in the US. I think it's that somehow Taiwan and Hong Kong are like in an abusive relationship with China, which couldn't be further from the truth. It's not it's just that's just not the reality, like you said. It's just the the Chinese and the Hong Kongers and the Taiwanese they identify as Chinese, the vast majority. Sure, you might have certain nationalist elements in Hong Kong
Yeah,
or Taiwan, but
right. Yeah,
it's there's no. I feel like there's no need for this animosity because China isn't doing anything to the people in Hong Kong or Taiwan that could be deemed as some type of oppressive,
right.
relationship.
Or it's really actually. I mean, it's just so very minor. I think recently there were a couple of people that were arrested in Hong Kong under this new security law. But like for example, even in Taiwan, for the most of Taiwan's history as separated from China since 1945, they have actually been under martial law for most of that time, and that was okay with us, right? And
Yeah,
it's just and Hong Kong, of course, was just a colony of Britain, and I think the British run it well, but they didn't have any real autonomy or very limited autonomy, and the fact is that the Chinese are running Hong Kong well. It's just they don't have an incentive to make people miserable there. They want Hong Kong to be a success, and it seems like they know how to do it. I mean, I think there's right. There's this impression of somehow these ogres and thugs in charge of these. Like we talked about Putin. They kept on saying, "Well, we know that Putin's a thug." These are actually very smart people who want um, who are concerned about popular support and implementing policies that do work and are and
mm,
and strengthen their countries. And overall, again, you can always have criticisms, and I know, like, Chinese that are critical of Xi Jinping, and your sister certainly knows a lot of people that are critical of Putin. But it just, but where isn't that true? It's true in our country too. And by and large, there's actually much more support and satisfaction with the leadership in China and in Russia than there is in the Western countries, where again we've talked about this. I mean, the approval ratings are just dismal. People are really unhappy with the leadership. And
mm.
we have elections, but they don't seem to matter. It seems like you elect somebody and the policies never change. We start to wonder really what's going on.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned like the security law. I think that's I think the what the protests in Hong Kong were mainly about were kind of the extradition powers of China to extradite people from China to Hong Kong and Taiwan,
Right.
and
But yeah,
it
but I don't think that was exceptional, though. I mean,
no,
other
I was
countries that have
right.
democracies have those same kind of
I was about to
laws,
say, like, we're trying to extradite, Julian Assange for, doing journalism and expressing his First Amendment rights so we can kill him.
Right.
We do this stuff all the time. And I remember everybody was upset in Hong Kong because there was some Taiwanese guy that, I think it was Taiwanese guy that murdered his Chinese
I think,
girlfriend
yeah,
and
he was an
fled
actual
Taiwan.
murderer,
Yeah,
right?
he was a murderer. And China's like, no, he killed a Chinese person, his Chinese woman
Yeah,
here in China. He fled back to Taiwan. And then, that's not okay. We are under a one child policy. So that's the type of thing that China was dealing with. Was an
right,
actual
right,
murderer and they wanted to
right,
extradite to bring him to
right.
justice. While we're extraditing people that expose the U.S. Military industrial complex, people like Assange and punish journalists. Go after Snowden, so they have to run and hide because we're
Yeah,
trying to get them. Through our extradition power. So if you actually look at the law on the face of it, and it's like it's completely reasonable.
yeah.
Anyways, how do you think this will play out? Do you think that Taiwan will try to declare independence with kind of a knowing that they have the backing of the United States? Because it seems like the U.S.
Yeah,
has basically said we will protect Taiwan if they
right,
declaim
right. Before
independence.
before the U.S. before the Biden took power, the U.S. Had a policy of strategic ambiguity, meaning that okay,
I'm
well,
hearing this
maybe
term
we'll
all the
support
time
them, maybe
now.
we, right. That actually I think made some sense. It's just like maybe, for example, if you decide, actually we do not want to go to war on behalf of Taiwan, but let's not let the Chinese know that. It would actually, if they wonder about, they're less likely to attack, right? So in that sense, that policy uh, could actually be very reasonable and beneficial. But Biden, Biden, I think, has at least four times declared that we will defend Taiwan, and each time, like the State Department has walked it back, that you're left wondering what's going on here. Either Biden just doesn't even know what's what, which is certainly a possibility,
Well, that's
or
true.
the yeah, right. or or maybe actually he's just revealing the secret policy that we will defend Taiwan. He's supposed to keep it ambiguous, and he forgets that because he doesn't remember
Hmm.
half of his instructions or whatever. Or it's clearly we are. It's a signal to China that yeah, strategic ambiguity is really over. We're only pretending to maintain it anymore. Anyway, it looks like it's come to an end,
Hmm.
and that we've committed to defending Taiwan, which just is not in American interest. Again, it could just be a total humiliation. One thing is that, like we're finding, like what's happening in the Red Sea. Basically, it's clear that Operation Prosperity Guardian has failed. And this was against the Houthis. This is he's like the kind of like the poorest guys on the
Yeah.
planet. And then you just firing missiles from caves. They can actually just bring this commerce through the Red Sea to a standstill. Or for those ships that they target anyway. And you can see they've been totally successful. There was nothing that the U.S. and the UK's efforts, to protect commerce there have failed totally. They just have failed totally. So what are you thinking you're going to do? It's just like the world has changed. One thing is that we've had a very powerful Navy, but navies just aren't what they used to be. These aircraft carriers and so on are tremendously vulnerable. And if our ships are so vulnerable to these Houthi missiles, what do you think is going to happen to the U.S. Navy
Hmm.
in the Strait of Taiwan?
Or just these drones. I mean, do you
Yeah,
just have the idea of how many drones China could produce a day that could just sink
right,
our whole navy or missiles? They could probably
right.
produce a million a day. The production
Yeah,
capacity of China
right,
is incredible.
right.
It really is something to marvel at. Like
They
I
can
just
they can
it's
just fill the sky with drones and
yeah. Well,
yeah.
I'm
Well,
just
I've heard that's
everything that
yeah,
they
right.
do. Like when the Chinese like their ability to engage in large infrastructure projects rapidly is incredibly impressive. Like you remember in COVID, they built a hospital that could hold like 20,000 people within a week, 7 days
Yeah,
from nothing to a full
right,
functioning hospital that with
right.
tens of thousands of beds. It's insane. They built the second tallest building in the world right in front of my balcony. I saw it go up in a year, just boom, 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 couple floors
Yeah,
a day. It's
yeah,
incredible. So,
right,
and if they have a and if they feel like they really need to mobilize and do something, watch out. You know what
yeah,
China can do. It has all the factories in the world, and it has unlimited energy now coming from Russia. Plus, Russia knows everything about U.S. weaponry now, thanks to Ukraine.
right,
They're going to
right,
help out China and say, okay, this is the way to do it. We made a few mistakes in the beginning here. This is what you want to do. Here's how you jam
right.
their
They know how to
defenses.
neutralize
Let
the,
your
the
right.
missiles and,
This is what
everything
you do
that
with
they're,
HIMARS. This is what you do with the TACOMs. This is how you take out the
yeah,
Abrams. This is how
right,
everything easy.
right.
It's
Yeah.
insanity. It's just so crazy that we're doing it that I just still can't believe that we actually might try to do this. Do you think
Yeah.
that this will actually happen? That we will there
Well,
will it's just
yeah, I
such a
know.
stupid
Right. Again, it just seems so crazy, but but that's no reason why it can't happen. I mean, for some reason, it's just like the military seems to be more intent on fighting China than it does Russia. Um, and I don't know why. Um, I think, well, they see, I guess it's hegemony at stake. They think, um, China could displace them, from the top spot, and that's the way they look at it. I think they really continue to underestimate and uh, you know denigrate Russia unnecessarily. It just really seems like they can't get away from the gas station masquerading as a country thing, but they do recognize the threat that China poses to their hegemony, and they just don't want to let go of it. And I think a lot of people say that maybe they're actually looking for a conflict sooner rather than later because they know that time is not on their side.
that I've heard that
That
theory as well. They feel
yeah.
like
So
this is
it
our
just
only
seems like a
chance.
crazy theory, but it's just but it may be true. And then you do have these hotheads in Taiwan. It's just a very bad mix. Just like Ukraine. Where we encourage the worst tendencies in in these countries, well, one's a region, the other's a country. Um, and Lai Ching, the Taiwanese president, is gone farther than anyone has gone so far, and everybody knows him to be really a very zealous, supporter of Taiwanese independence. It's clear that he's going to work towards it, and he's going to keep on, pushing the envelope, and he may just push too far. We'll see.
It's incredible how far the U.S. has fallen in 2 or 3 years. Just
Yeah,
since the Russian invasion. Well, even before that, you can talk about COVID. It, it's just amazing. Like
yeah,
we've gone insane. I think our problem, like I said, is that we don't know what to do. We're losing power and we're noticing it, and that's the issue, is that we realize that, hey, the only thing we can do is we have to preserve our hegemony, make sure we show everybody that we're number one, and so we
right.
got to start wars everywhere. We got to take on the
Yeah,
two most powerful countries in the world now to reassert our dominance. We got to
right.
show Russia who's who, show China who's who.
Yeah,
But we can't win either of these conflicts, and it's becoming more and more apparent.
right.
Yeah, I don't know. It just seems so insane. Do you think so? There are basically two ways I think this will either play out, is that Taiwan will declare independence and then we'll get the reaction from China, or it'll be kind of something similar to Ukraine where it keeps on pushing to a moment and China begins to build up, mobilize, and says, okay, we just got to move first. We got to take it
Uh-huh.
now. What do you think happens? China moves first into, or the official declaration of
Well,
independence from Taiwan?
yeah. Well, I think, well, the first military move would be by China, but it probably will be in response to yeah, something that Lai Ching-te says, or maybe we'll see something similar to uh, what happened in Ukraine. In the months leading up to it, the the Russians went on a diplomatic offensive, trying to avoid the war. Say, okay, look, this is really serious. We got to work this out. Here, let's talk. And of course that failed. But maybe the Chinese will try to do something similar and say, look, look, we're doubly, triply serious about this. Okay, we have to get these guaranteed, or we're going to have to reach a agreement, more than just words, but take a real step towards peaceful unification. And we'll probably blow it off, and then maybe we'll see. Maybe that'll be followed by uh, military conflict.
Military, yeah. Um, do you see that happening soon? Do you think it could be this year? I mean, like, what's when would
I
the Biden administration want to have this, conflict? I mean, who's pushing for this conflict? Is it the right?
Yeah, it seems
Is it the
I
bipartisan?
right, right. I don't know. It's just like, how would that play? I don't know, because you may have, if we do launch something, a war, you do get a rally around the flag, and usually the current president is, at least initially, receives a surge in popular support.
Well,
So
not when he's
maybe it's
got
something.
other wars going on that nobody
Yeah,
likes, right?
right. Yeah, I don't know. It kind of depends on how it happens, but um, yeah, I think it's maybe when people start saying that, oh, what you're talking about, actually sending hundreds of thousands of our troops
Well, there's a
to
rally
Taiwan.
around the flag if there was an attack on U.S. soil or like 9/11 type
Uh-huh.
of thing. Why would there be a rally around the flag for Taiwan? Like you said, people don't understand the history. It's not existential to them. They don't
Right.
have any skin in the game. They don't understand the politics of these two countries at all.
Yeah.
So
Well, I'm,
why
I'm
would there
thinking of,
be?
for example, I think it's the first Persian Gulf War that under Bush Senior. I think he had. I mean, this was not really an attack on us. It certainly wasn't. Right. It was in response to the Iraqi attack on Kuwait. But we became involved. It was a very popular war.
Yeah,
Actually,
well,
it
I
was
think
overall a very popular war. But the difference is that was Iraq, and it was just like, we could we kicked some Iraqi butt, and we were really tough,
right.
and we kicked the Vietnam syndrome for, as Bush Senior himself famously said. And but it's not going to be like that. It's going to be ugly. It's not going to end well, and it could start off disastrously. I It still is hard to predict sometimes how people react. I would think, probably just out of, caution, that like the Biden policy would be to avoid, if really try to avoid a war with China, over Taiwan before the election, and avoid any kind of, try to keep, Ukraine together, at least. um, More or less holding together, before the election. And then after that, who knows? Either they escalate, or they just pull out.
Yeah, utter insanity. I just that we're even
But
contemplating this or even
yeah,
talking about
but the
this
thing
is
is, these
crazy.
people are just not. I don't know. They're not thinking clearly themselves, so they just might get themselves into a conflict, and like they did in Russia, they miscalculated terribly, and the probably Ukraine will not hold together, before the election. The whole thing probably will, the front probably will collapse before
Right.
truly collapse, before the election.
Right. I think, a big problem with, this country is that, we're not truly a democracy. If, the government is so large that 99.9% of the government are not elected officials. They are part of this permanent bureaucratic state, all these three-letter agencies, and they all sit around working and conniving on certain projects, Project China
Hmm.
or Taiwan. And then that's the momentum. Then that's what pays their bills. And, you get all these people that, go through the system, go to Ivy League schools. They work hard to be part of this system. And so people don't, I
Hmm.
think, realize how large and powerful the system is. Yeah, that people might be like, why can't we just have freedom? It's like, well, you have to realize that there is a huge amount of money and a huge
Yeah.
amount of people that are tied to this permanent bureaucracy of the U.S. government, that they
Right. And
need to keep these things going. And
Right,
that's
and
the
they're pretty
problem.
much impervious to popular opinion.
Right, exactly. So they don't have any, they don't care about us because they've been working on this for 40 years. They know that even if one
Right,
president comes, the next one goes, we're still working on this. The Pentagon
right.
still
Well, it
has
was
its
famous
policy.
actually, like during the impeachment hearings over Trump, the first impeachment hearings. It was, I think it was Vindman. It was a Ukrainian American, that he testified. He said that, well, they had to stop Trump because he was opposing the policy on Ukraine. I said, but he's the elected president. He's
Right.
supposed to
He's
represent the will of the people. And
right.
this is, but they didn't even think that way. It's
It's
like,
an open
what
admission. Right.
yeah, right. It was just like yeah, he said it because I think among them, that's just the way they think. They didn't even stop to think about it
Right.
any other way.
They
Like,
think
what's
they
this
know
guy?
better.
He's representing the will of the people, but that has nothing to do with what we're doing here.
Right. You see
You're
it
against the
time,
policy.
right, time and time again. Like
Right.
Victoria Nuland, another example. Under Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
She keeps the
Right.
project moving. And she's
Right.
unelected. She's a bureaucrat. And that's just one example of, I think, millions within our government. That there are
Hmm.
millions of people that are working towards whatever type of goal, and it justifies their salary, and they can become obsessed with the project, and they think that they know best for this country, and they don't. You don't have to worry about what they're doing. They're not elected. Just go along, play your election games every 4 years. But we know what we're doing, and we're in control. And we got to take down, preserve Western hegemony. We got to take down Russia. We got to take down China. And don't worry, we've been
Hmm.
working on this for a long time. I think that's the problem. You just
Yeah.
have that deep state movement. You can't stop it. You have to gut the system. You got to just
Yeah.
disband.
Well, it seems to be true throughout the Western world. I mean, again, we just have governments that are completely unresponsive to popular will. I mean, if they were truly wise leaders, who were had the best interests of the countries that they are and really understood what was going on, maybe that wouldn't be so bad. But they clearly are deluded and are just taking us down a path of destruction. And it doesn't seem to matter when the people protest about it.
Yeah. Well, it makes for great podcast content. So at
Yeah,
least we
right.
can say that. Okay. We're over an hour now. Would you
Okay.
want to do a quick recap of the gossip here? Or do you want to save that for Wednesday?
Um, well, why don't I do it just real
Okay.
quick?
Let's.
As you know, that the U.S. constructed this pier. I think it was March that Biden said that they were going to do it, and they spent the more than a month putting it together. I think it ended up costing twice as much as it was supposed to. Like everything that the U.S. military or the U.S. government does. Um, and the big question to me, before we get to the big question is, okay, they set it up, and I think there were like a few trucks went down the causeway. I think they were immediately looted the whole, and so very little was delivered to Gazans.
When you say looted,
And
looted by who? Other
actually by the
Gazans?
Gazans themselves,
Yeah.
which is completely understandable. They're starving, and these trucks came over. There's a process like that these trucks that cross through Rafah, or there's an Aaron crossing, or there's what's the other one called? It doesn't matter. There are total like 3 or 4 crossings. The ones that go on the land crossings, the deliveries are made to UNRWA. And there's this procedure, and everything. If the Israelis don't bomb the convoy, or the UNRWA work, or shoot the UNRWA workers, or the starving people, the food generally is distributed fairly efficiently. But clearly they didn't have a system in place. It didn't work out. Um, but anyway, okay. First of all, the big question is why. I've never had explained to me anybody provided anywhere close to a satisfactory explanation why this floating pier was set up. Because we have these land crossings. The problem is that Israel has been closing them periodically, or deliberately reducing the number of trucks that are allowed to cross. And well, this is can't the U.S. just make it clear to Israel that okay, you got to let more trucks across. We obviously obviously do have, some influence there. Instead, we build this floating pier on the other side, and it's okay. I guess the goods are supposed to come from Cyprus, and the arrangement was that the Israelis would check everything that went on. They would have control, at that point. Um, but why? This
Yeah,
is
right.
this bizarre. And it's saying, are they trying to do an end run around the Israelis? Well, no, because it was actually apparently just a couple of weeks after the Gaza operation began. Netanyahu actually proposed it together. Biden and Netanyahu together, brought this possibility up. And then if you look back, you find that the Israelis have been talking about this for years, going all the way back to 2010. It's something they've been kicking around, and I still don't really understand why. Now, there's something very interesting that may at least partially explain it. That is, okay, these trucks were not supposed to go to UNRWA, which is again, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency that has been distributing food and, other goods within Gaza. They go to another United Nations agency called the World Food Program, which is completely distinct from UNRWA. And of course, UNRWA has been targeted by Israel. They made this claim that there were actually, like Hamas
Mm.
militants in the area. It turned out to be nothing. The thing was very carefully investigated. There was no truth to that whatsoever. And some of the European countries that had initially had sanctioned UNRWA, lifted their sanctions when they found it, but the U.S. never did. So they continue to regard, without any grounds, they continue to regard UNRWA as a terrorist, infiltrated organization. And so anyway, this was supposed to go to the World Food Program. Now, guess who's the director of the World Food Program? Cindy McCain. Yes, it's
John
that
McCain?
McCain, John
John McCain?
McCain's wife.
Oh,
John
really?
McCain's wife, like Mr. Warmonger,
Yeah, Neocon 101, right?
and,
Yeah.
and so you just stop and wonder, like, okay, this must be have something to do with it. It's like maybe trying to do an end run around UNRWA, or um, but the whole thing, of course, has just been a total disaster because soon after they set it up and attempted to make some deliveries unsuccessfully, then a storm hit and the thing broke apart. Half of it sunk. The four boats that were moored to it ended up being were uh, washed ashore on the beach there and were grounded. And so now they've towed the whole thing back up to an Israeli port. I think it's Ashdod, where it's being repaired. But the whole thing just seems so absurd, and it's just nobody's ever, especially in administration, has never gone ahead and said why they're doing this, why this makes sense, why this is necessary, why they can't just use the land crossings, and why would Israel actually seem to support it and be behind it? I don't know.
Maybe they want because they assume like, well, we're going to take all of Gaza anyways, and now thanks for building us a pier that now we can use for
Yeah, well,
ourselves.
I mean, this is a temporary pier. It's not something that they would. Who knows? I don't know. They maybe they have some.
Some money embezzlements, kind of sending
Who
it to
knows?
lining pockets.
Yeah,
Yeah, well, it's very it's par for the course for America. That's a perfect just sort of example representation of the United States. The amount of insanity and inefficiency and just throwing money down the drain. It's
right.
just yeah, that's us. That's that's America for you. It's crazy.
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, the whole thing has just been a total disaster. I mean, this project, the Red Sea project, of course, then the greatest disaster of all is Gaza itself.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, the frustrating thing is there's never any reflection. It's like, okay, well, let's move on to the next stupid project. Maybe we
Yeah,
can make
right.
it even
Yeah, which is
stupider
always,
than last
yeah,
time.
right, right. It's never actually, it's always a case of doubling down or just continuing, the policy that didn't work. It's never say, okay, this hasn't been working for the last 20 years. Let's try something else. Let's go, maybe we should go in another direction. Never
Right.
happens. Right. Okay. Well, I just wanted to say
Yeah, okay,
about the
good.
floating pier.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
not
I
even
was
there
struck
now.
by it. Nobody had mentioned it, but Cindy McCain is the director of the program
Yeah,
that's
that's
linked to this.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just more corruption is that's what
Yeah.
that spells for me. That's what it
Uh,
shows. Okay, we'll end it there then. Okay, thanks a lot, Dad.
all right.